In 1910, a team of British archaeologists working in the ruins of the ancient city of Meroe in what is now northern Sudan made a discovery that didn't make sense. They were excavating the remains of a temple complex, carefully removing layers of sand and rubble that had accumulated over nearly 2,000 years of abandonment. The work was methodical, painstaking, the kind of slow archaeological labor that produces mostly pottery fragments and architectural details, and occasionally, if the team is fortunate, something that rewrites the history books. They found it beneath the entrance steps, buried deliberately under the threshold of the temple, face down in the packed earth, positioned so that every person who had ever walked into this building had stepped directly on top of it. A bronze head, life-sized, exquisitely crafted. The features of a young man with a strong jaw, carefully styled hair, and eyes made of inlaid glass and stone that seemed to stare upward through 2 millennia of dirt with an expression of imperial calm. The metalwork was extraordinary. The casting was flawless. The preservation was remarkable, the dry Sudanese earth having protected the bronze from the corrosion that would have destroyed it in a damper climate. The archaeologists recognized the face immediately. Every classically educated European in 1910 would have recognized it. It was Augustus Caesar, the first emperor of Rome. The man who had ended the Roman Republic and created an empire that would dominate the Mediterranean world for 5 centuries. The most powerful human being of his era, and one of the most powerful human beings who had ever lived. His head was buried under the doorstep of an African temple, face down in the dirt, positioned so that the feet of African worshippers would grind against his imperial features every time they entered the building. The archaeologists were baffled. How did a bronze head of Augustus Caesar end up in Sudan? How did it end up buried under a doorstep? And who had put it there? The answers to those questions lead to a story that the classical world tried to minimize, that European historians tried to ignore, and that most people alive today have never heard. The story of an African queen who attacked the Roman Empire at the height of its power, defeated Roman legions in open battle, captured the symbols of Roman authority and brought them home as trophies, lost an eye in the fighting and kept fighting, forced Rome to send one of its best generals against her, and then fought him to a standstill, and ultimately compelled Augustus Caesar himself, the ruler of the known world, to negotiate a peace treaty as an equal. Not as a conquered subject, not as a tribute-paying vassal, as an equal. Her name was Amanirenas. She was the Kandake of the Kingdom of Kush, and she buried the head of Augustus Caesar under her temple steps so that her people would walk on the face of Rome forever. This is her story. And unlike so many stories of African achievement, this one doesn't depend on oral tradition, on archaeological inference, or on the painstaking reconstruction of suppressed histories. This one was documented by the Romans themselves, in the writings of Strabo, Pliny, and Dio Cassius, 3 of the most important historians of the ancient world. Rome recorded its defeat because the defeat was too significant to hide. And the evidence, a bronze head weighing approximately 35 pounds, is sitting right now in room 70 of the British Museum in London, where anyone can walk in and look at it for free. But to understand what Amanirenas did and why it matters, you need to understand the civilization she was defending, because the Kingdom of Kush was not what European historians have spent centuries pretending it was. It was not a minor tribal state on the fringe of Egyptian civilization. It was not a collection of nomadic peoples scratching a living from the desert. It was one of the oldest, most sophisticated, and most powerful civilizations in the ancient world. And by the time Amanirenas came to power, it had been challenging, trading with, conquering, and being conquered by Egypt for over 1,000 years. The Kingdom of Kush occupied the territory along the Nile River south of Egypt, in what is now northern Sudan and parts of southern Egypt. Its heartland was the region between the 3rd and 6th cataracts of the Nile, a stretch of river valley that combined fertile agricultural land along the riverbanks with access to some of the richest mineral deposits in northeast Africa. Gold, iron, and precious stones flowed from Kushite mines into the trade networks of the ancient world. Ivory and exotic animals from Central Africa moved north through Kushite territory toward the Mediterranean markets. The civilization was ancient in a way that makes most other historical states look like recent arrivals. The earliest Kushite settlements date to at least 2500 BC. The Kingdom of Kerma, the first major Kushite state, was a contemporary of Egypt's Middle Kingdom, trading and competing with the pharaohs a full 1,000 years before the Trojan War, 15 centuries before the founding of Rome, and more than 2 millennia before the birth of Christ. Kush wasn't just old, it was accomplished. The Kushites built pyramids, more than 200 of them. In fact, more pyramids than Egypt ever constructed. These weren't crude imitations of Egyptian architecture. They were distinctly Kushite structures, steeper and narrower than their Egyptian counterparts, built over the tombs of Kushite kings and queens in necropolis complexes at Meroe Nuri and El Kuru that represented centuries of continuous architectural development. The Kushites developed their own writing system, Meroitic script, which remains only partially deciphered today. They were among the earliest iron-smelting civilizations in Africa, developing metallurgical technologies that made Meroe one of the most important centers of iron production in the ancient world. Some scholars have called Meroe the Birmingham of Africa, a comparison that, while Eurocentric in its framing, captures the scale and significance of Kushite industrial production. The Kushites maintained trade networks that connected Central Africa to the Mediterranean and through intermediaries to India and the Far East. They had diplomatic relationships with the Persian Empire, the Greek kingdoms that succeeded Alexander the Great, and eventually with Rome itself. They were not isolated. They were not unknown. They were active, sophisticated participants in the international system of the ancient world. And they had a political tradition that was unique in the ancient world and that directly shaped the story of Amanirenas, the Kandake system. In Kushite political culture, women held positions of genuine executive power in ways that had no parallel in the contemporary Mediterranean world. The title Kandake, which Greek and Roman sources transliterated as Candace, referred to a queen who ruled in her own right, not as a regent for a minor king or as a ceremonial figurehead, but as the actual head of state with full authority over military, diplomatic, and domestic affairs. The Kandake system was not a novelty or an exception. It was a centuries-old institution embedded in Kushite political culture. Multiple Kandakes ruled Kush across the centuries, their reigns documented in temple inscriptions, royal monuments, and the accounts of foreign observers who struggled to comprehend a political system in which women held the kind of power that their own cultures reserved exclusively for men. Roman writers consistently described the Kandakes with a mixture of fascination and confusion. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing under the Roman Empire, described the Kandake as a masculine sort of woman who was blind in one eye. The description reveals more about Strabo's assumptions than about Amanirenas herself. He couldn't simply describe a powerful female ruler. He had to masculinize her, to frame her power in terms that made sense within his own gendered understanding of authority. She couldn't be a powerful woman, she had to be a masculine woman. The distinction tells you everything about how the classical world processed the existence of female political power. Amanirenas came to power as Kandake of Kush sometime in the late 1st century BC. The exact date is uncertain. Kushite chronology is less precisely established than Egyptian or Roman chronology, partly because the Meroitic script has not been fully deciphered, and partly because Kushite historical records suffered from the same processes of destruction and neglect that affected most African civilizations. What is clear from the available evidence is that Amanirenas was ruling Kush by approximately 27 BC, and that she inherited a kingdom that was about to face the most dangerous threat in its long history. Because in 30 BC, something happened 700 miles to the north that changed everything. Cleopatra died, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the final ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty that had governed Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great 3 centuries earlier. She died by her own hand, according to the traditional account, after her lover Mark Antony's defeat by Octavian in the Roman civil war that would determine the future of the Mediterranean world. With Cleopatra's death, Egypt became a Roman province. The richest, most agriculturally productive territory in the Mediterranean world was absorbed into an empire that was already the largest and most powerful political entity on the planet. Octavian, who would shortly take the name Augustus and the title of emperor, now controlled the entire Nile Valley from the Mediterranean to the first cataract at Syene, modern Aswan. Or at least, he thought he controlled the entire Nile Valley. What lay beyond Syene, in the territory where the river continued southward through cataracts and desert toward its distant sources, was a question that most Romans hadn't bothered to ask. The standard Roman assumption was the standard European assumption about Africa that would persist for the next 2,000 years. There was nothing significant beyond the boundaries of the known world. The territory south of Egypt was empty, primitive, inhabited by people who didn't matter and couldn't resist. This assumption was about to be tested. And the test was going to be administered by a one-eyed queen with an army of 30,000 warriors and a very clear understanding of what Rome's arrival in Egypt meant for the future of her kingdom. Amanirenas watched Rome's annexation of Egypt with the strategic attention of a ruler who understood that the geopolitical landscape had just shifted fundamentally. For centuries, Kush's northern neighbor had been a known quantity. Egypt under the Ptolemies had been a trading partner, an occasional rival, and a civilization that Kush understood intimately from 1,000 years of interaction. The Kushites knew how the Ptolemies thought, how they fought, how they negotiated. The relationship was complex but manageable. Rome was different. Rome was an unknown, and what the Kushites were learning about this unknown was alarming. Rome didn't trade with its neighbors, it absorbed them. Rome didn't negotiate with rival powers, it conquered them. Rome didn't respect the sovereignty of kingdoms on its borders. It imposed tribute, demanded submission, and eventually, inevitably, incorporated its neighbors into a system of provincial administration that left local cultures intact in form but subordinate in substance. The first signs of Roman intentions came quickly after the annexation of Egypt. Roman garrisons were established at Syene and on the island of Philae, at the traditional boundary between Egyptian and Kushite territory. Roman tax collectors appeared in the border region, imposing tribute on communities that had traditionally been within Kush's sphere of influence. Roman officials began treating the Kushite border territories as extensions of their new Egyptian province, ignoring the existing political arrangements that had governed the region for generations. Amanirenas sent diplomatic communications to the Roman governor of Egypt, protesting the incursions and asserting Kushite sovereignty over the border territories. The Romans responded with the diplomatic equivalent of a shrug. The border communities were now Roman subjects. Their tribute was owed to Rome. If the Kushites objected, they were welcome to discuss the matter with the legions stationed at Syene. It was the kind of dismissive response that empires give to powers they consider too insignificant to take seriously. The Romans had just conquered Egypt, the most powerful kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean. They had defeated Cleopatra and Antony. They had absorbed the legacy of Alexander the Great. The idea that a kingdom south of the First Cataract, a kingdom most Romans couldn't locate on a map, would pose any meaningful challenge to Roman authority was so absurd that it didn't warrant serious diplomatic engagement. Amanirenas received Rome's dismissal and began planning her response. Not a diplomatic response, not a protest, not an appeal to Roman reasonableness or international custom. A military response. She assembled an army. The sources vary on exact numbers, but the most reliable estimates suggest a force of approximately 30,000 warriors. The Kushite military was a combined arms force that reflected centuries of adaptation to the challenges of warfare in the Nile Valley and the surrounding desert. The core was infantry armed with swords, spears, and bows. Kushite archery was renowned throughout the ancient world. The Egyptians had called Kush Taseti the land of the bow, a name that reflected the lethal proficiency of Kushite archers. Supporting the infantry were cavalry units, war elephants that had been trained for battle, and specialized units equipped for siege warfare. The army also included Amanirenas' son, Akinidad, who served as a co-commander and who would play a significant role in the campaign that followed. The presence of both the Queen and the Crown Prince at the head of the army demonstrated the seriousness with which Kush treated this confrontation. This wasn't a border raid, this was a national mobilization. Amanirenas timed her attack with the precision of a commander who had been studying her enemy's dispositions with careful attention. In 25 BC, the Roman governor of Egypt, alias Gallus, had taken the bulk of his military forces on an expedition to Arabia, attempting to extend Roman control over the lucrative trade routes of the Arabian Peninsula. The campaign was a disaster. Gallus's forces were decimated by disease, dehydration, and the resistance of Arabian tribes who knew their territory far better than the Romans did. But the campaign's failure was less significant for Amanirenas' purposes than its timing. With Gallus and his legions bogged down in the Arabian desert, the Roman garrison along the Kushite border was at minimal strength. The frontier that Augustus believed was secure was, at that specific moment, defended by a skeleton force that couldn't withstand a serious assault. Amanirenas struck. The Kushite army crossed the border in the summer of 25 BC and hit the Roman positions like a wave breaking over a sandcastle. The first target was Syene, the garrison town at the first cataract that served as Rome's southernmost military outpost in the Nile Valley. The garrison was undermanned, its best soldiers away with Gallus in Arabia, its remaining troops unprepared for an assault of the scale that Amanirenas brought down on them. The attack on Syene was not a tentative probe or a limited raid. It was a full-scale military assault involving thousands of warriors converging on the town from multiple directions simultaneously. Kushite archers, the finest in the ancient world, laid down covering fire that pinned the Roman defenders behind their walls, while infantry units advanced on the fortifications with ladders and siege equipment. The Romans fought back with the discipline and training that made Roman soldiers the most effective infantry in the Mediterranean world, but they were vastly outnumbered and hopelessly isolated from reinforcement. Syene fell within days. The Roman garrison was overwhelmed. Soldiers who survived the assault were captured. Roman military equipment, weapons, armor, standards, and supplies were seized by the Kushite forces. The town that had been the symbol of Roman authority at the edge of the known world was in Kushite hands. Amanirenas didn't pause. She pushed north to the island of Philae, the sacred Egyptian temple complex that the Romans had garrisoned as a secondary defensive position. Philae was both a military installation and a religious site of enormous significance, home to the Temple of Isis that had been a center of worship for centuries. The Romans had recognized its symbolic importance and had stationed troops there to demonstrate that Roman power extended even over the sacred places of the conquered. The Kushite assault on Philae was as swift and as devastating as the attack on Syene. The garrison fell. The temple complex was occupied. And Amanirenas' forces did something that carried symbolic weight as heavy as any military victory. They tore down the Roman statues. Roman practice throughout their empire was to erect statues of the emperor in every conquered territory, every provincial capital, every military outpost. These bronze and marble figures served as permanent reminders that the territory belonged to Rome, that the emperor's gaze fell upon every subject, that Roman power was not just military, but divine. Augustus, who had declared himself a god, expected his image to be treated with the reverence owed to a deity. Amanirenas' soldiers pulled the statues down. They toppled the representations of Rome's god-emperor from their pedestals and carried them away as war trophies. Among the captured objects was a life-sized bronze head of Augustus, severed from its statue, its glass and stone eyes staring at nothing as it was loaded onto a cart and transported south into the heart of Kushite territory. Amanirenas knew exactly what she had taken and exactly what it meant. This wasn't looting for its own sake. This was psychological warfare conducted at the highest level of symbolic sophistication. She had not merely defeated Roman soldiers, she had captured Rome's god. She had taken the face of the man who claimed to rule the world and reduced it to cargo, to plunder, to a trophy being hauled back to Africa by the very people Rome considered too primitive to merit serious attention. The capture of Elephantine, another fortified Roman position in the border zone, completed the Kushite sweep of Rome's southern frontier. Within weeks, every Roman military installation south of central Egypt had been captured or destroyed. The border that Augustus believed was secure had been erased by a Kushite army that Roman intelligence had failed to detect, Roman military planning had failed to anticipate, and Roman garrisons had failed to resist. It was during the fighting at one of these border engagements, the specific location varies between sources, that Amanirenas was wounded. An arrow or a projectile struck her in the face, destroying her right eye. The wound was severe enough to be permanently disfiguring. In most accounts, it happened during combat, while Amanirenas was personally directing the assault on a Roman position, close enough to the fighting to be within range of defensive fire. A lesser leader might have withdrawn. The loss of an eye is not just a physical injury. It fundamentally alters spatial perception, balance, and the ability to assess distance. For a military commander who needed to read terrain, judge the distance of enemy formations, and make tactical decisions based on visual assessment of a fluid battlefield, the loss of an eye was a functional catastrophe. Amanirenas continued fighting. She continued commanding. She led her army through the remainder of the border campaign with one eye bandaged or missing, visible to every soldier in her force, a living demonstration that the Kandake would not be stopped by anything the Romans could do to her body. The wound became, paradoxically, a source of strength. Her soldiers saw a queen who bled for them, who took the same risks they took, who absorbed punishment that would have broken most people and kept going. The one-eyed queen became not just a commander but a symbol, an embodiment of Kushite defiance that was worth more than any speech or ritual. The Romans, when they eventually wrote about Amanirenas, couldn't help but mention the eye. Strabo described her as blind in one eye, but noted her courage and the skill with which she commanded her forces. It was, coming from a Roman source, the kind of grudging compliment that an empire gives to an enemy it cannot dismiss. They called her masculine because their language had no framework for female power that didn't reference male standards. But they recorded her abilities with an honesty that later European historians would not match when writing about African leaders. The Romans, for all their prejudices, were practical people. They respected competence, even when it came from a source they considered inferior, and Amanirenas was undeniably competent. With the border secured and the Roman garrisons destroyed, Amanirenas withdrew the bulk of her forces south, carrying her trophies, her prisoners, and the bronze head of Augustus Caesar. She had accomplished everything she set out to accomplish. The Roman installations that had threatened Kushite sovereignty were gone. The tribute that Rome had illegally imposed on Kushite border communities would not be collected. And Rome now knew, with a clarity that no diplomatic communication could have achieved, that the kingdom south of the First Cataract was not a collection of primitives waiting to be absorbed. It was a military power capable of striking Roman territory, defeating Roman soldiers, and humiliating the Roman emperor in ways that the entire ancient world would hear about. The bronze head of Augustus traveled south with the Kushite army along the Nile, through the cataracts and the desert, deep into the heart of Kushite territory. When it arrived at Meroe, the capital, Amanirenas made a decision about what to do with it that was so perfectly calculated, so exquisitely designed to deliver maximum symbolic humiliation, that it still resonates 2,000 years later. She buried it, not in a treasure vault, not in a trophy room, not in a place of honor where captured enemy artifacts might be displayed as proof of military achievement. She buried it beneath the entrance steps of a temple dedicated to victory, face down, in the dirt, positioned so that every single person who entered the temple, every priest, every worshipper, every common citizen of Meroe who came to give thanks for Kushite victories, would walk directly on the face of Rome's god emperor. Every footstep was an act of desecration, every entrance was a triumph. Every day that the bronze face of Augustus lay in the dirt beneath Kushite feet was a day that the most powerful man in the ancient world was being ground into the earth by the people he had tried to subjugate. It was genius, not military genius, though Amanirenas had demonstrated plenty of that, political genius, psychological genius. The genius of a leader who understood that defeating an empire on the battlefield was significant, but defeating it in the symbolic realm was permanent. Armies could be rebuilt, garrisons could be re-established, borders could be redrawn, but the image of Rome's god emperor lying face down under African feet, that was an insult that couldn't be erased. It would last as long as the temple stood. And, as it turned out, it would last far longer than that. But Amanirenas' triumph had a consequence that she had certainly anticipated and prepared for. Rome didn't forgive, Rome didn't forget. And Rome didn't accept humiliation from anyone, least of all from a kingdom that it hadn't even considered worth thinking about 6 months earlier. When news of the Kushite attack reached Augustus in Rome, the response was swift, furious, and massive. Augustus was not just angry about the military defeat, though the destruction of Roman garrisons was humiliating enough. He was personally insulted by the capture and desecration of his own image. In the Roman political theology that Augustus was carefully constructing, the emperor was divine. His statues were sacred objects. Their destruction or desecration was not just a political act, but a religious one, an offense against the divine order that Rome claimed to represent. Augustus ordered a retaliatory campaign. The command was given to Gaius Petronius, the prefect of Egypt, a seasoned military commander who had spent years managing Roman interests in the complex and volatile environment of the Eastern Mediterranean. Petronius was not alias Gallus, the incompetent who had led the disastrous Arabian campaign. He was a professional, a methodical tactician, and a man who took the Kushite threat seriously enough to prepare for it properly. Petronius assembled a force of approximately 10,000 soldiers. These were not the skeleton garrisons that Amanirenas had overwhelmed at Syene. These were frontline Roman legionaries, the most effective heavy infantry in the ancient world, supported by cavalry, auxiliaries, and the siege equipment that Roman armies routinely carried for reducing fortified positions. They were equipped with the standardized weapons and armor that centuries of military evolution had refined into the most lethal infantry kit available anywhere on the planet. The gladius, the short stabbing sword that Roman soldiers used in close combat with devastating efficiency. The pilum, the heavy javelin designed to penetrate shields and armor. The scutum, the large rectangular shield that Roman infantry used in the famous testudo or tortoise formation to create an almost impenetrable wall of wood and metal. Petronius marched south from central Egypt with the methodical efficiency that characterized the best Roman military operations. He didn't rush, he secured his supply lines. He gathered intelligence about Kushite positions and dispositions. He ensured that his force was properly equipped and provisioned for a campaign in the extreme conditions of the Upper Nile Valley. And when he was ready, he struck. The Roman counterattack began with the recapture of the border territories that Amanirenas had seized. Syene, Philae, and Elephantine were retaken with minimal resistance. The Kushite forces that had been left to garrison these positions were not the main army. They were holding forces, sufficient to maintain control but not designed to withstand a full Roman assault. Petronius swept through them and pushed south into Kushite territory itself. Amanirenas had withdrawn her main force south of the border after her initial campaign, exactly as Petronius would have expected. But she hadn't withdrawn far, and she hadn't withdrawn in disorder. The Kushite army was intact, reorganized, and positioned in terrain that the queen had chosen specifically for its defensive advantages. The first significant engagement between Petronius's legions and Amanirenas's main force occurred in the desert terrain south of the border zone. The details are preserved in Strabo's account, which drew on official Roman military reports, and they paint a picture of an encounter that did not go the way the Romans expected. The Kushites didn't run. They didn't scatter before the advancing legions the way that most opponents of Rome eventually did when confronted with the disciplined advance of armored heavy infantry. Amanirenas had positioned her forces on ground that neutralized some of the Roman advantages. Her archers, the legendary bowmen of Tarseti, opened the engagement at ranges that surprised the Roman commanders. Kushite bows, powerful composite weapons crafted from layers of wood and horn, had effective ranges that overlapped with Roman javelin range, meaning that Kushite archers could engage Roman infantry before the legionaries could close to their preferred fighting distance. The fighting was fierce. Strabo's account describes a battle in which the Kushites fought with determination and skill, maintaining their positions far longer than the Romans anticipated. But Roman discipline and Roman equipment eventually told. The legionaries advanced through the arrow fire, locked shields, and engaged at close quarters where their armor, their formation fighting, and their brutally efficient short swords gave them decisive advantages. The Kushite line broke. Amanirenas's forces withdrew south, deeper into their own territory. Petronius pursued. He pushed past the border zone, past the traditional boundaries of Egyptian influence, into territory that no Roman army had ever entered. He was operating on the principle that had guided Roman military strategy for centuries. Don't just defeat the enemy, pursue them until they can't threaten you again. Destroy their capacity to make war. Impose terms so harsh that they never dare to challenge Rome a second time. He reached Napata. Napata was one of the most sacred cities in Kushite civilization. It had served as the original capital of the Kingdom of Kush centuries earlier, before the center of political power shifted south to Meroe. It remained a city of enormous religious and cultural significance, home to temples, royal tombs, and the great mountain of Jebel Barkal, a flat-topped peak that the Kushites revered as the dwelling place of the god Amun. Napata was to Kush what Jerusalem was to the Jews, or what Delphi was to the Greeks. Its significance was not primarily political, it was spiritual. Petronius destroyed it. The Roman forces sacked Napata with the thoroughness that Roman military operations were famous for. Temples were looted, buildings were demolished or burned. The accumulated treasures of centuries of Kushite civilization were seized as war plunder. The destruction was not incidental, it was calculated. Petronius intended to break the spirit of Kushite resistance by destroying one of the most sacred places in the Kushite world. He then withdrew northward, establishing a fortified garrison at Primis, modern Qasr Ibrim, a cliff-top fortress that commanded a strategic position along the Nile. He left a substantial force there, with orders to hold the position and prevent any Kushite attempt to re-enter the border zone. Then he returned to Egypt, reported to Augustus that the Kushite threat had been neutralized and awaited the congratulations that Roman generals expected after successful campaigns. He had defeated the Kushite army in the field. He had penetrated deep into Kushite territory. He had destroyed one of their most sacred cities. He had established a fortified position that blocked any future Kushite advance. By every conventional measure of Roman military success, the campaign was a complete victory. Petronius believed the war was over. Amanirenas had a different opinion. Part 3. The destruction of Napata was supposed to break Amanirenas. That was the logic behind it. That was the logic that Rome had applied to every opponent it had ever faced, from Carthage to Gaul to Judea. Destroy the sacred, destroy the symbolic, destroy the places that give a people their identity, and the people themselves will submit because the psychological foundation of their resistance has been demolished. The logic had worked across 3 continents and 5 centuries of Roman expansion. It had worked against civilizations far larger and more powerful than Kush. It had worked against the Greeks, who had invented democracy. It had worked against the Carthaginians, who had produced Hannibal. It had worked against the Gauls, whose warrior culture was legendary. Every people Rome had faced had eventually broken when Rome destroyed what they held sacred. Amanirenas did not break. The reports that reached Petronius in the months following his withdrawal from Napata should have disturbed him more than they apparently did. Kushite forces were regrouping. The army that had retreated before his advance was being reinforced, reorganized, and resupplied from the deep Kushite heartland around Meroe, hundreds of miles south of the furthest point Petronius had reached. The supply lines, the recruitment networks, the military infrastructure that sustained the Kushite army were all beyond his reach. Embedded in territory so far from Roman Egypt that projecting force there was logistically impossible. Amanirenas had understood from the beginning what Petronius was only beginning to realize. Geography was her ally. The Nile Valley between the First and Fourth Cataracts was a long, narrow corridor of habitable land surrounded by desert. An army advancing south along this corridor extended its supply lines with every mile it traveled, becoming more vulnerable, more dependent on a single route of communication, more exposed to the same kind of rapid strike that had overwhelmed the Roman garrisons at Syene and Philae. Rome could reach Napata. Rome could even reach Meroe, though the logistical challenges of such an advance would be enormous. But Rome could not hold territory along a 1,000-mile corridor of desert and river against a population that knew the terrain intimately, that could strike at supply lines anywhere along that corridor, and that had demonstrated both the willingness and the capacity to fight. Amanirenas had lost the battle at Napata. She had lost a sacred city. She had lost soldiers, equipment, and prestige. But she had not lost her army. She had not lost her capital. She had not lost the economic and human resources that sustained her kingdom. And she had not lost her will. She rebuilt her forces with a speed that caught the Romans off guard. Warriors were called up from across the Kushite territory. Weapons were manufactured in the iron-smelting workshops of Meroe, the industrial infrastructure that made Kush one of the few African kingdoms capable of producing its own military equipment in quantity. Supplies were stockpiled. Intelligence was gathered about the disposition of Roman forces along the border and specifically about the garrison at Primis. Akinidad, Amanirenas' son and co-commander, played a central role in the military preparations. The sources suggest he was responsible for organizing the logistics of the campaign, managing the complex task of assembling and supplying a large army in the arid conditions of the Upper Nile Valley. His involvement demonstrated the Kushite political system's capacity for shared leadership, the Kandake and her designated heir working together as a command team rather than competing for authority. The target Amanirenas chose for her second offensive revealed a strategic mind operating at the highest level. She didn't strike at Syene or Philae, the border positions that Petronius had recaptured. Those positions were now heavily reinforced, their garrisons alert and prepared for exactly the kind of assault that had overwhelmed them the first time. Hitting them again would be costly and probably unsuccessful. Instead, she struck at Primis, the fortress that Petronius had established as the cornerstone of his defensive strategy, the position that was supposed to block any future Kushite advance into the border zone. The garrison that Rome considered the most secure and strategically important military installation in the Upper Nile Valley. The choice was brilliant for several reasons. Primis was isolated. It was the southernmost Roman position, deep in territory that was culturally and geographically Kushite rather than Egyptian. Its supply lines ran north along the Nile, through territory where Kushite sympathizers and agents could monitor and potentially interdict Roman communications and logistics. The garrison was strong, but it was a fixed position, and fixed positions have a fundamental vulnerability. They can be surrounded. Amanirenas brought her army north in early 24 BC, approximately a year after Petronius's destruction of Napata. The march was conducted with an operational security that prevented Roman intelligence from detecting the Kushite advance until it was too late for the garrison at Primis to call for reinforcement. When Amanirenas' forces appeared around Primis, the garrison commander found himself surrounded by an army that outnumbered his force many times over, with no possibility of relief arriving before his supplies ran out. The siege of Primis was not a quick affair. Roman fortifications were among the best in the ancient world, and Roman soldiers defending prepared positions were extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. The garrison at Primis fought with the stubborn professional determination that made Roman armies the most formidable military force of the era. They manned their walls, they sorted against Kushite positions, they rationed their supplies and maintained discipline under conditions that would have broken less well-trained troops. Amanirenas didn't try to storm the walls. She had learned from her first campaign, where the assault on Roman positions had cost her warriors heavily. Instead, she applied pressure, constant pressure. Her archers maintained a continuous harassment of the walls, forcing the defenders to remain under cover and preventing them from resting. Her infantry probed the defenses at different points, testing for weaknesses, keeping the garrison stretched and uncertain about where the main attack would come. She cut the supply lines completely, ensuring that nothing and nobody entered or left the fortress without her permission. She also deployed psychological pressure. Kushite war drums sounded throughout the night, denying the garrison sleep. The sounds of a massive army surrounding the fortress, the noise of thousands of warriors maintaining their positions, sharpening weapons, moving equipment, created a constant auditory reminder that the Romans were trapped, outnumbered, and far from home. The siege lasted weeks. The garrison's supplies dwindled. Water became critical. The Roman commander maintained discipline and held his position, but he was fighting mathematics as much as he was fighting the Kushites. Every day consumed supplies that couldn't be replaced. Every casualty was a permanent reduction in fighting strength. Every hour of lost sleep eroded the physical and mental capacity of soldiers who were already operating at the edge of their endurance. Meanwhile, Amanirenas demonstrated the other dimension of her leadership, the diplomatic skill that distinguished her from a purely military commander. While her army maintained the siege, she sent envoys to Petronius and through him to Augustus's representatives in Alexandria. The envoys carried a message that was simultaneously a military threat and a diplomatic opening. The message, reconstructed from Roman accounts, communicated something that the Romans found simultaneously infuriating and impossible to dismiss. Amanirenas was not asking for peace. She was not begging for terms. She was offering Rome a choice. Continue fighting a war that Rome couldn't win at an acceptable cost, in territory so far from Rome's center of power that maintaining military operations would drain resources needed elsewhere. or negotiate a settlement that recognized the reality that both sides already understood. Kush was not going to be conquered, not easily, not cheaply, and not without a commitment of military resources that Augustus could not afford to divert from the threats he faced along every other frontier of his sprawling empire. The timing of this diplomatic approach was as calculated as any military maneuver. Augustus, in Rome, was managing an empire that stretched from Spain to Syria. Germanic tribes were threatening the Rhine frontier. Parthia remained a persistent threat in the east. Rebellions simmered in newly conquered provinces across Europe. The Arabian campaign had been a costly failure. And now the Kushite War, which was supposed to have been a quick, punitive expedition, was turning into an ongoing commitment that tied down troops and consumed resources in one of the most remote and least economically productive corners of the Roman world. Augustus did something extraordinary, something that the Roman Empire almost never did. Something that violated every principle of Roman imperial strategy, every tradition of Roman military culture, every expectation of how Rome dealt with peoples who challenged its authority. He negotiated. Not from a position of overwhelming strength, not from a position where negotiation was merely the formalization of a military fait accompli. He negotiated because the alternative, continued war against a determined enemy in difficult terrain at the far end of an impossibly long supply line, was worse than the concessions that negotiation would require. Kushite envoys traveled to the island of Samos, in the Aegean Sea, where Augustus was conducting imperial business in 21 or 20 BC. The fact that Augustus received them personally, rather than delegating the negotiation to a subordinate, indicates the seriousness with which he treated the Kushite challenge. Emperors didn't waste their time on insignificant opponents. Augustus met with the Kushite representatives because he recognized that Amanirenas had forced him into a position where he had to deal with her directly. The Treaty of Samos, as the resulting agreement is known to historians, was a document that would have stunned anyone familiar with standard Roman diplomatic practice. Its terms were not the terms that Rome typically imposed on defeated enemies. They were the terms of a negotiation between equals. Rome withdrew from all Kushite territory. Every position that Petronius had captured south of the traditional border was abandoned. The garrison at Primus was pulled back. Roman military presence was restricted to the established Egyptian boundary at Syene and Philae. Rome cancelled the tribute. The taxes and payments that Roman administrators had been extracting from communities in the border zone were formally revoked. The people of the border region would not pay Rome for the privilege of being Rome's neighbors. Rome established a fixed, permanent border, not a frontier of Roman expansion that could be pushed forward at Rome's convenience, but a defined boundary that both sides agreed not to cross. Rome was accepting a limit on its own expansion, something that the Roman political system was fundamentally designed to avoid. Rome agreed to a trade relationship, not the extractive, one-sided commercial exploitation that Rome typically imposed on its neighbors, but a genuine trade arrangement that allowed goods to flow across the border on terms acceptable to both parties. There was no tribute from Kush to Rome. There was no requirement that the Kandake acknowledge Roman sovereignty. There was no demand for hostages, the practice by which Rome typically guaranteed the good behavior of treaty partners by holding their royal children in Roman custody. The treaty treated Kush as what Amanirenas had always insisted it was, an independent kingdom, a sovereign state, an equal. No other sub-Saharan African state achieved this against Rome. No other kingdom south of the Mediterranean forced the Roman Empire to negotiate a peace treaty that conceded virtually every Roman war aim. The Treaty of Samos was, in the context of Roman imperial history, an anomaly, a moment when the most powerful empire in the ancient world looked at an African kingdom and decided that the cost of conquest was higher than the price of respect. Amanirenas had won. Not just a battle, not just a campaign. She had won a war against the Roman Empire and extracted peace terms that recognized her kingdom's sovereignty and independence. She had done it with an army that was technologically inferior to Rome's legions. She had done it while blind in one eye. She had done it after watching Rome destroy one of her most sacred cities. And she had done it through a combination of military force, strategic patience, and diplomatic sophistication that left even Rome's own historians unable to deny her achievement. Before we continue to the final chapter of Amanirenas' story, subscribe to this channel. Every week, we're uncovering stories that rewrite what you thought you knew about history. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss the next one. Because the story of what Amanirenas did with her victory, what she did with that bronze head, and what it means that you can still see it today, that's coming next. Amanirenas returned to Meroe not as a survivor but as a conqueror. Not the desperate, Pyrrhic kind of conqueror who wins by enduring more punishment than the enemy is willing to inflict. The genuine kind. The kind who sets out to achieve specific objectives and achieves every single one of them against an opponent that the rest of the world considered invincible. She had set out to stop Roman expansion into Kushite territory. She had stopped it. She had set out to cancel the tribute that Rome had imposed on her people. She had cancelled it. She had set out to force Rome to recognize Kush as a sovereign state rather than a future province. She had forced exactly that recognition. And she had done it against the most powerful military machine the ancient world had ever produced, at the peak of its power, under the command of its most capable leaders. The bronze head of Augustus was still where she had placed it, beneath the entrance steps of the temple, face down in the dirt, waiting for the feet of her people to grind against the features of the man who had claimed to rule the world. Now, with the Treaty of Samos signed and Roman legions withdrawing to the border that Amanirenas had defined, the head's placement took on a new dimension of meaning. Before the treaty, burying Augustus's face under Kushite feet had been an act of defiance, a gesture of contempt from a people at war. After the treaty, it became something else entirely. It became a statement of permanent victory. Rome itself had acknowledged, through the formal mechanism of an international treaty, that it could not dominate Kush. The head in the dirt was no longer a wartime insult. It was a historical monument, a physical record of the fact that an African queen had made Rome beg for peace, and Rome had complied. Every person who entered that temple for the next 3 centuries walked on the face of Augustus Caesar, priests performing sacred rituals, worshippers seeking divine favor, children accompanying their parents to ceremonies, farmers giving thanks for good harvests, soldiers departing for campaigns and returning from them. Generations of Kushite citizens lived and died and passed through that doorway, each footstep a tiny repetition of the original act of triumph, each entry a renewal of the victory that Amanirenas had won. The head lay there while Augustus consolidated his empire in Europe. It lay there while Tiberius succeeded him. It lay there while Caligula went mad and Claudius conquered Britain and Nero burned Rome. It lay there while the Roman Empire reached its greatest extent under Trajan and began its long decline under his successors. It lay there while the empire split in two, while barbarians sacked Rome, while the Western Empire collapsed entirely. The head outlasted the empire, whose power it represented. The bronze face of the man who had ruled the world remained in the dirt beneath African feet long after the world he had ruled had ceased to exist. Amanirenas herself lived on after the treaty, continuing to rule Kush through the final years of her life. The exact date of her death is uncertain, as is the case with much of Kushite chronology, but she appears to have ruled into the early years of the 1st century AD. Her son, Akinidad, who had served as her co-commander during the Roman wars, likely succeeded her or continued to play a significant role in Kushite governance after her death. The Kingdom of Kush endured for centuries after Amanirenas. The Kandake system that had produced her continued to produce capable female rulers who governed the kingdom through periods of prosperity and challenge. The civilization that had built more pyramids than Egypt, that had developed its own writing system, that had mastered iron smelting technology, that had maintained its independence through 1,000 years of competition with its northern neighbor, continued to function as a sophisticated, independent state for another 300 years after Amanirenas' death. The kingdom finally declined in the 4th century AD, weakened by a combination of environmental changes, economic shifts in the Red Sea trade networks, and military pressure from the Kingdom of Aksum to the southeast. The city of Meroe was abandoned, the temples fell into disrepair, sand drifted over the pyramids and the palaces and the iron-smelting workshops. The writing system fell out of use, leaving modern scholars unable to fully decipher the records that the Kushites had created over centuries of literacy. And beneath the steps of a temple that nobody visited anymore, a bronze head lay in the darkness, forgotten by everyone except the earth that held it. For nearly 2,000 years, that head waited. Above it, empires rose and fell. The Roman world collapsed. Islam swept across North Africa. The medieval period came and went. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, the scramble for Africa, which carved the continent into European colonies with the same casual brutality that Rome had applied 2 millennia earlier. The territory that had been the Kingdom of Kush became part of Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, governed by British administrators who knew nothing about the civilization beneath their feet and wouldn't have cared if they had. And then, in 1910, a British archaeologist's trowel struck bronze. The discovery of the Meroe head, as it became known, was one of the most significant archaeological finds of the early 20th century. The British archaeologist John Garstang, leading an excavation at the temple site in Meroe, uncovered the head and immediately recognized its subject, Augustus Caesar, the first Roman emperor. Buried face down under the entrance of an African temple, Garstang understood the historical significance of what he had found. The bronze head was physical proof of an event that Roman historians had documented, but that modern European scholarship had largely ignored or minimized. An African kingdom had defeated Roman legions, captured Roman imperial symbols, and buried the face of Rome's emperor under its feet as a permanent act of triumph. The head was removed from Sudan and taken to London, where it was eventually placed in the collection of the British Museum. The irony of this journey was lost on no one who thought about it carefully. An artifact that an African queen had captured from the Romans as a trophy of African victory over European imperialism was itself captured by the British and displayed in a European museum as a trophy of European control over Africa. The head that Amanirenas had placed under Kushite feet now sat behind British glass. But the head also did something that no amount of colonial scholarship could prevent. It proved the story. It existed. It was real. It was physical. It could be weighed and measured and chemically analyzed and art historically dated. It was not an oral tradition that European scholars could dismiss as folk memory. It was not an archaeological interpretation that could be debated into ambiguity. It was a bronze head of Augustus Caesar, conclusively dated to the correct period, found in exactly the location that the historical sources described, buried in exactly the manner that the story demanded. The Meroe head made Amanirenas' victory undeniable. You could argue about the details. You could debate the exact size of her army, or the precise terms of the Treaty of Samos, or the specific sequence of military engagements, but you could not argue that the event itself hadn't happened. The head was there. It was real, and its existence demanded an explanation that only one story could provide. An African queen defeated Rome and took the emperor's face as a trophy. The head sits today in room 70 of the British Museum. It is displayed in a glass case with lighting designed to highlight the extraordinary craftsmanship of the bronze casting and the eerie realism of the inlaid glass and stone eyes. The museum label provides basic historical context. Most visitors walk past it without understanding what they're looking at. They see a well-preserved Roman bronze. They note the quality of the work. They move on to the next display. They don't know that the last human hands to touch that head before Garstang's archaeological team belonged to Kushite workers who buried it face down in the earth on the orders of a one-eyed queen. They don't know that for 3 centuries, African feet ground against those perfectly cast features every day. They don't know that the head represents not just Roman artistry, but Roman humiliation, not just imperial portraiture, but imperial defeat. They don't know about Amanirenas, and the reason they don't know is the same reason most people don't know about most African history. Because the story of an African woman defeating the Roman Empire doesn't fit the narrative that European civilization has spent 2,000 years constructing about itself and about Africa. The narrative says Rome was invincible. Amanirenas proved it wasn't. The narrative says African civilizations were primitive. Kush had been building pyramids and smelting iron, while Rome was still a collection of mud huts on the Tiber. The narrative says women in the ancient world were subordinate to men. The Kandake system produced female rulers with genuine executive power, centuries before any European society would do the same. The narrative says European empires brought civilization to Africa. Amanirenas fought one of those empires to a standstill and forced it to negotiate as an equal. Every element of Amanirenas' story contradicts the assumptions that have shaped how the world understands the relationship between Europe and Africa. And that is precisely why her story has been ignored, minimized, and excluded from the mainstream historical education that most people receive. But the head remains. That's the thing about physical evidence. You can ignore a story, you can suppress a tradition, you can exclude an entire civilization from your textbooks and your curricula and your cultural consciousness. But you can't argue with 35 pounds of bronze sitting in a glass case in one of the most visited museums in the world. The head is there. It has always been there. And it will be there long after every excuse for ignoring it has been exhausted and every reason for suppressing Amanirenas' story has been exposed for what it is. The Kingdom of Kush lasted for over 1,000 years. It produced more pyramids than Egypt. It developed its own writing system. It mastered technologies that placed it among the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world. It produced female rulers with genuine power, centuries before any European society considered such a thing possible. And when the most powerful empire in human history tried to absorb it, it fought back, won, and buried the enemy's god-emperor face down in the dirt. Amanirenas was blind in one eye. She fought the Roman Empire with the other. She lost a sacred city and rebuilt her army. She was defeated in the field and came back stronger. She besieged Roman fortresses and forced Roman generals to reconsider their assumptions about African military capability. She sent envoys to Augustus Caesar and negotiated a treaty that treated her kingdom as Rome's equal. She took the head of Rome's emperor and buried it under the feet of her people as a permanent monument to the fact that Africa could not be conquered by anyone who underestimated it. She did all of this in the 1st century BC, more than 2,000 years ago. And the evidence of what she did is sitting right now in a museum in London, waiting for someone to walk up to the glass case, look Augustus Caesar in his bronze face, and understand the real story behind how that face ended up in Africa, in the dirt, under the feet of a civilization that the world has spent 2 millennia trying to forget. The head is in room 70 of the British Museum. Admission is free. You can walk in off the street and stand in front of it. You can look at the face of the man who ruled the ancient world and know that the last person to decide what happened to that face was a one-eyed African queen who had just forced his empire to negotiate as an equal. You can see the evidence with your own eyes, both of them. Amanirenas only needed one. If this story changed how you think about the ancient world, if it challenged what you were taught about Rome and Africa and what civilizations are capable of, If it made you want to walk into the British Museum and look at that bronze head with new understanding, then hit that like button. Share this video with everyone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because every single week we're uncovering the histories that were hidden in plain sight. Empires, warriors, queens, and civilizations that should be household names but were buried by people who found their achievements too inconvenient to acknowledge. And here's what I want from you. Drop it in the comments. Have you seen the Meroe head in person? If you have, tell me what it felt like, knowing the story behind it. If you haven't, tell me this. Now that you know what it represents, will you go? Because history isn't just something you read about. Sometimes it's something you can stand in front of, look in the eye, and finally understand. Room 70, the British Museum. The head is waiting. It's been waiting for 2,000 years. It can wait a little longer for you.